Oh, wait a minute. I don't seem to have that one handy.
Well, if you find it, you can do it at the end, or you can add it on, or whatever. That would be great.
Oh, wait a
Uh,
minute. I might have it. There it is. Let's try that one
so
there.
we are now live on YouTube and live on Zoom. And folks, I want to tell you that pretty soon we will also be live on Boston Cable Access. Um, that is up and coming. We're very excited about that. And as usual, we start with a candle. A candle to wish you a happy new year, to tell you that we had uh, a very informal New Year celebration here at the church. We had maybe about a dozen people. We were um, we were nourished by pupusas and tamales prepared by Luis Guzman, our Salvadoran cook and janitor. And we had a bunch of people come through, look at what we have in this auditorium now, despite the loneliness of COVID and this auditorium. We still have a room full of books that came from Robert Datilio's house. He passed away a year and 2 months ago. And we have also in this auditorium still, but it's going away, a beautiful display of Salvadoran crafts and embroideries and coffee. So it's been a very wonderful new year down here. And of course, out in Copley Square, the ice sculptures and the live music and the everything. So very informally, we really celebrated here, and I hope you did too. And I hope for a wonderful 2022. We have a lot of great programs coming up for you, including this one that we're about to embark on, the first of the year. Uh, Rod MacDonald is a living legend in my mind and in the minds of many. You know of him as luminary on the New York folk Greenwich Village scene. Has written so many wonderful songs and is still at it like crazy. Go to his website, you'll find out that tonight, even, he's being part of a celebration of Christine Lavin's 70th birthday with a whole bunch of great people. You can hear him there, and you can hear him right now. I'm just so glad that we get to invite folks from all over the planet. It's a beautiful new thing about this Zoom thing, and we hope we can do the best with it in the future. Rod MacDonald, welcome to Community Church and Happy New Year.
Thanks, Dean. Happy New Year to you, too, and all you folks out there. How's everybody doing this morning? Bright and early? Or some people, maybe this is very late, I don't know, but let me organize this back here. We had a quiet New Year's here, Dean. Pretty simple. Didn't go much of any place until my 13-year-old daughter got frustrated and said, "This family's no fun," and insisted I go out into the parking lot and do a leprechaun dance with her while she shot off some sparklers. But up till then, it was pretty laid back. But we're doing okay now, I guess. How about I go ahead and sing a song for you folks? I was reading about some of the things that Jacques is going to speak about today, and I thought maybe I'd just like to start off with this song, which is kind of about the personal side of these things. In another teenage dream, she was only 17. He was the handsomest boy in town. But he was a poor boy in blue jeans, so he joined the U.S. Marines to have a future when he came back home. Then a new president was voted in, promising with a forceful grin, we won't let the enemy push us around. After training him to be a man, they sent him to Afghanistan, leaving his wife and newborn son behind. 2 tours later when he's home, he's in a world of his own. His eyes seem so far away. She tries to remember when he was her lover and best friend, before he saw the things he couldn't say. Until the day the word comes back, he's returning from Iraq with a flag draped over his remains. She'll go back to her hometown, raise her son on her own, and try to start her life over again. And the leaders of the USA sit down on a rainy day, making plans they later will deny. But who will bear the sacrifice? The children's mothers and the wives. And do they ever ask themselves why? And in another foreign land, where the wind breathes only sand, a young man in a village must decide to live there and be occupied, or join the other side and fight an enemy with weapons in the sky. Who can pinpoint his parents' home, blow up everyone in his town, from a trailer in Las Vegas where they view the funeral by his village wall? When he comes, they kill them all, and they know there's nothing they can do. And the leaders of the USA say we're making progress every day. Soon the enemy will give up the fight. Then a single man bomb on his chest blows up a market in the West. And do you ever ask yourself why? People of the USA get down on their knees and pray for victory and mercy from on high. But forgiveness waits around the bend in a war that never ends. And do you ever ask yourself why?
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful, Rod. This man has the sweetest voice in all of folkdom, say I, and I love hearing you every time we've hosted you here or at our Watertown Coffee House, the El Salvador Sister City Group. Hey, I want to read a quote. If God was homophobic, I want to go to the other place. Desmond Tutu. Rest in peace, Desmond Tutu. A man of God, if there ever was one, who took up the cause of LGBT folks early on before his church caught on, and also took on the cause of Palestine, which is the next thing I want to tell you about. I'll first show you my hat, which was hand embroidered at my most recent trip to El Salvador by my friend Maribel for me. She does a bunch of embroidery that's also for sale on the table. will be for another week or so. But BDS is boycott, divest, and sanction. And I want to just mention that by way of announcing to you incredible program we have coming up. And it's on Tuesday, January 11th. And his name is Mazen Kumsia, and he's the founder and director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History. Mazen has presented a number of times before, and he is just an engaging and funny and wonderful presenter, Professor Mazen Kumsia, and his basic talk is about trying to do science in the midst of a brutal occupation. It's a funny thing. He was going to be here live, but because of COVID, he canceled his tour. But he's still willing to join us virtually at 7 p.m. on Tuesday night, January 11th, even though in Bethlehem it's 2 in the morning. But we should be talking about Bethlehem right now because that's where this guy Jesus was born. And in 2 days, in Costa Rica, which is where I was born and grew up, they celebrate El Dia de los Reyes Magos, which is when the three wise guys came to visit. And it reminds me of that beautiful song by Aeneas Mitchell. When we came through the cold. We came bearing gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh, and there were angels singing, and there were trumpets playing, there were shepherds there in that West Bank town. Welcome home, my child. Your home is a checkpoint now. Your home is a border town. Welcome to the war. Life ain't fair, my child. Put your hands in the air, my child. Slowly now, single file, up against the wall. Where we now our warmest coats, where we now our walking shoes. Open wide the city gates and let us through. A child was born in Bethlehem, born in a cattle pen, born on a killing floor. Still he no crying makes, still as the air is he lying so prayerfully there, waiting for the war. Welcome home, my child. Your home is a checkpoint now. Your home is a border town. Welcome to the wall. The brawl, life ain't fair, my child. Put your hands in the air, my child. Slowly now, single file, up against the wall. When we came to the cold. We came bearing gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh, and there were angels praying, and there were lions laying down with the lamb in that West Bank town. And he so loved the world, and he so loved the world, and he so loved the world. Aeneas Mitchell, by way of telling you to join us on January 11th for Mazen Kumsia, joining us from Bethlehem. Did you hear about Banksy who built a hotel in Bethlehem? It's called the Walled-Off Astoria. That mysterious guy Banksy. I've been finding out about a lot of mysterious things in this collection of books that we have behind us. I'll show you a little bit of it. That's about 1/3 of it. The rest of it is upstairs, still in boxes. We're still taking it out. And it's been an enormous task bringing these books here, but it's rich. It's really rich. It takes up a lot of space too. That's the downside of it, and we're going to have to figure out what to do with it and get rid of a lot of it. But the part that we're going to still have is incredible. Bob Datilio was interested in so many things, all things literary, all things historical, all things anarchism, communism, socialism, anarcho-syndicalism, labor unions, and it's all here, and there's a lot of books. He was also very interested in art, photography, dance, music, opera musicians, conductors. There's books by and about all of those things. It's just really rich, and I hope that we can turn it into a magnet for to draw people here to enjoy this thing, whatever it is. I don't know if it's a used bookstore or if it's a library or if it's what it could become, which is the whole building could be a repository for the libraries of luminary scholars of the left. Maybe, maybe not. It's not up to me. There's a board of directors that makes those decisions. I want to announce a couple of things here that came to us. There were among the throngs out in Copley Square on New Year's Eve. There were also protesters from First Night Against the Wars, and they had signs about freeing our award winner. Julian Assange won our 2021 Sacco and Vanzetti Award, and his brother and his father were here to receive it. And those folks came by afterwards for pupusas and coffee to warm up, and they brought a couple of little announcements. One is for January 6th, and it's a rally at the State House. Say no to fascism, defend working people and the oppressed. And it's, of course, the first anniversary or commemoration of that horrific thing that happened in DC, January 6th. There's also Sunday, January 9th, 6:30 p.m., Defending Our Movement. Victims of police brutality are standing up and demanding justice. The Boston May Day Coalition is involved in a number of movement defense cases on the left. Learn about who we are defending, what the cases are, and how you can help. January 9th, there's more information on Boston MDC, May Day Coalition Facebook page. There you go. This is our new newsletter, just came out. If you'd like a paper copy of it, which we still send out, we haven't gotten over our obsession with paper. I just heard about this word. It's the word. Now I don't remember the word. I just remember the meaning. It's somebody who loves the smell of books. Well, we still do paper, and we send out a paper newsletter. You can also get it by email if you sign up for our mailing list. Just you can do that in the chat if you'd like, and we'll take it down. We'll send you the information, add you to our list. We have every Sunday event. Let me read some of the things coming up. This next Sunday, which is the 9th, Nick Rabb is a young representative of the Sunrise Movement. He's a student at Tufts University, and he's speaking about choosing between liberation and climate catastrophe. Music by Steve Tilston. Steve is a phenomenal British songwriter and guitar player like extraordinaire, and a veteran of the early British folk scare. Steve Tilston. Let me say that also we have Martin Luther King Day, Charles Coe, an old friend of ours, a poet. We also have, of course, Mazen Kumsia on the Tuesday night, 11th. Mark Martin is talking about conservation on the Salmon River. This came from a trip that my wife and I took celebrating her retirement. Jennifer, I love you, and you're so amazing. After 40 years, she just retired this past week. We took a trip on the Salmon River, and this is a guide who will talk about the endangered wild salmon on the Salmon River in Idaho. Wonderful program. Then we have Regis Tremblay and Bruce Gagnon. They are two Maine-based activists. Regis is a filmmaker. He happens to live in Ukraine right now, in Odessa, Ukraine or Russia, depending on who you are. And then after that, we have a program on Nicaragua. Margaret Morgenroth Goulet, and it goes on from there. So we have full plate. Full plate. I want to see if there's anybody else who wants to announce any upcoming events, actions, protests, demonstrations.
Revolutions?
If you'd like, you can also put it in the chat and we will know about it that way. And if there is no one else, I want to also say that this is not just a virtual event. We are physically meeting here and a few people attend. We've had 3 here this morning. Ed, who's one of our board members, and Carolyn and Lenny Shames was here, but he had to drive back to Maine, which is where he lives. And so we are inviting you to, if you feel safe, be in live attendance here and enjoy all the books that are here and on our 3rd floor as well. And also enjoy a luncheon afterwards with whatever Luis Guzman, our cook and janitor, has prepared for us. Let's hand it over to Rod MacDonald.
Why don't you do it?
Because I'm not sitting there typing.
Rod MacDonald, you have the floor.
Thanks, Dean. Hi again. I was talking to Jacques before the meeting got started today, and he was talking about mentioning the idea of conscientious objection, which, of course, I believe actually started in the United States in the Civil War. I'm not sure about that, but in World War I became a little more prominent. So I thought that I'd like to sing you kind of a medley of a couple of songs here, and I'll try to keep it reasonably brief. The first one of these was a #1 song in 1916, though pretty much forgotten today. I teach what's called Music Americana at Florida Atlantic University's lifelong learning program down here in South Florida. And as such, they have me do concerts now and then, and one of them was the songs of World War I. And I was very intrigued to find that of all these songs that were mostly recruitment songs of World War I, the biggest hit was actually a song that was quite the opposite. I haven't sung this song a lot, so I'm going to kind of fumble with it and then go into one I know a little better that's much more recent. But let's try it. 10 million soldiers to the war have gone, who may never return again. 10 million mothers' hearts must break for the ones who died in vain. Head bowed down in sorrow in her lonely years. I heard a mother murmur through her tears, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Let nations arbitrate their future troubles, it's time to put the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. What victory can cheer a mother's heart when she looks at her blighted home? What victory can bring her back as she cared to call her own? Let each mother answer in the years to be, remember that my boy belongs to me. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to put a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Let others arbitrate their future troubles, it's time to lay the sword and gun away. there'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. The general said, you're young, I guess you don't understand. We gotta have these things in case it gets out of hand. I say, what if they are like you, always got to be on top? Isn't there somewhere to end it? Isn't there some place to stop? What if everyone thought like you? The general said to me. Oh, what a vulnerable country we would be. What if everyone thought like you? The general said to me. I say there would be some peace. There just might be some peace. Broker said, you're young, I guess you don't comprehend. These people are walking around, gotta have some money to spend. And how can there be any money if we don't sell the things we can build? I say, why don't you build something else to use without having to kill? What if everyone thought like you? The broker said to me. Oh, what a poor nation this would be. What if everyone thought like you? The broker said to me. I say there would be some peace. There just might be some peace. Stop the war, stop the war, stop the war within yourself. And you won't need to fight with someone else. Stop the war, stop the war, stop the war within yourself. And you won't need to fight with someone else. Now you won't need to fight. You won't need to fight with someone else. Newsman said, you're young, I guess you don't see the light. It ain't what goes on during the day, it's what goes out to the people at night. The people, they like a good show, how can you deny them their due? I say, what does that say about us? What does that say about you? What if everyone thought like you? The newsman said to me. Oh, what a boring world this would be. What if everyone thought like you? The newsman said to me. I say there would be some peace. There just might be some peace. You know there would be some peace. Stop the war, stop the war, stop the war within yourself. And you won't need to fight with someone else. Stop the war, stop the war, stop the war within yourself. And you won't need to fight with someone else. Now you won't need to fight. You won't need to fight with someone else. You won't need to fight with someone else. Yeah, you won't need to fight with someone else. Now you won't need to fight with someone else. Yeah, you won't need to fight with someone else. Stop the war, stop the war, Stop the war within yourself, and you won't need to fight with someone else.
Thank you, Rod. Just beautiful.
Let me just say briefly about those two songs. The first one, of course, is from 1916. The second one I wrote in the back room at the Idler Men's Club in Harvard Square about a few years ago, about my own experience becoming a conscientious objector. And so I'm, I guess, throwing my 2 cents into the ring there, and very interested in hearing what Jacques has to say about the subject.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for those songs, Rod. Rod MacDonald, everybody. I want to invite you about something else, community church related, that's going to happen every Friday. And it's called Winter Fridays. And I will be hosting a ton of my wonderful music friends every Friday. It's a free concert. You can buy a ticket though if you like, and it's sliding scale. You can pay whatever you like. All proceeds to the performers, and it starts with a tiny honorarium from Community Church that our board approved, and it is supplemented and matched by a little gift from my mother. Thank you, Mom. And these Fridays are going to start this Friday with a walloping, amazing concert by Susie Williams and Bill Burnett. They are longtime, amazing friends. I've recorded several of Bill's songs over the years, and Susie Williams is a force of nature like you would not believe. Rod, you might have heard of Susie Williams and Bill Burnett. They were in New York at some of the same time you were. Susie was part of a duo named Storm and Norman and Susie. And then she and Bill performed his songs amazingly, and that's what we'll be hearing this Friday. So join us Friday night, every Friday night, all through the winter at 7, a bunch of different players, and I will put the list up in the chat. And it's really a feast of performers every Friday. Also, I just am really excited to invite anybody who likes to come down here and have a look at these books. And just take them in. We are here. We have official office hours Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can come during the day. Just send an email in advance. My email, dean@deanstevens.com. Very simple. Or you can call the church. Crystal Rollins Jackson is our office and publications manager, and just take in what we have just plopped into this auditorium, which is incredible amount of books which tell a rich story. And I have been very interested and hungry to learn from these books. I am not a scholar like Bob Datilio was. I've never read Marx, and I know what brought me to Community Church, which was anti-imperialism and U.S. interventionism in Central America, but it's all here, and I'm hungry to learn, and that's why I'm so excited that Jacques is joining us today. Jacques is born in Belgium, but a Canadian resident, holds a PhDs in history at York University and political science at University of Toronto. Jacques has lectured at various universities in Ontario and has published many articles and 10 books available in 9 languages. Jacques is married and has 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Congratulations, Jacques, and we wish you and your family a very happy new year. And I want to thank also Charlie Welch and Joan Livingston and Suren Mudliar for suggesting that we host Jacques at Community Church. Jacques, we are eager to hear from you. The floor is yours. Let's say thank you to Jacques for joining us from Canada, from Toronto, Canada.
Well, from near Toronto, Canada.
Near Toronto.
A place called Brantford. Yes, well, thank you very much, Dean, for this nice introduction. And they have Merry Christmas. It's a bit late, but Happy New Year to all of you and to all those present today. It's for me, an honor and a pleasure to be here and have a chance to, well, to talk a bit about not my book. I mean, I have a book coming up, and of course, in a way, it's a bit promotion for a book, but it's actually also based on some of my previous books. I've written mostly about the 20th century history, about the two world wars, about the rise of Hitler and other fascists. And I'm also keenly interested in the 19th century. And actually, the 19th century, as you may know, has been described by some historians as the long 19th century, meaning it started early, namely in 1789. So technically still in the 18th century. And that's because that was the year that the French Revolution started, 1789. And it could also be said that the 19th century lasted a little longer than a normal century, because in many ways, it didn't really end until that awful Great War broke out in 1914. So the 19th century lasted from 1789, so to speak, until 1914. And so you have the French Revolution, you have the First World War, you have the rise of fascism, you have the Second World War, and then you have the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. These are the kinds of things that I have been interested in and that I have written about in a number of my books. The first of which, well, in some ways, the first one was called The Myth of the Good War, which focused on the United States history with respect to the Second World War. And it's actually now, and that's the one that's been translated into 9 languages and has gone through quite a few editions already. And even though I wrote it in 2000, 20 years ago, I still keep updating it. And my French publisher just asked me to write a new edition, so to work on a new edition. So the interest in it remains very high. But I have a book coming out in April, and it's going to be called The Great Myths of Modern History, or some such title, because the publishers like to play around with these titles. And that will deal with all these big topics: the French Revolution, the First World War, the rise of fascism, the Second World War, the Cold War. And within these wars, sub-themes like, for example, Pearl Harbor, and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which Rod mentioned to me earlier as we were talking about all this prior to the official start of this program. So my book, my way, my approach to modern history, and with modern history, we can argue about the terminology, but I really mean from 1789 to the present. So from the French Revolution via the First and Second World Wars to the present. So my interest is in debunking myths about modern history, debunking great myths about the French Revolution, about the First World War, about Hitler, about Pearl Harbor, about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and so on. Because a lot of the history that is presented to us now, a lot of conventional history, a lot of mainstream history that is presented to us, not only doesn't come to us in the form of history books written by very learned scholars at famous universities, but also through newspaper articles, the media promote history, and of course documentaries on TV, and of course Hollywood. I mean, it seems to me one of the big problems we have is that most people learn their history now from Hollywood. And it really upsets me sometimes when I happen, rarely, to watch a Hollywood blockbuster of some sort, like Saving Private Ryan, for example, and it bothers me an awful lot. The falsehoods, the distortions, the omissions, the BS that's woven into these admittedly fine movies, well made and all that. But I mean, as far as history is concerned, they promote not history in the sense that they do not reveal the historical reality, but they promote really historical myths about the topic at hand. And this is what I like to debunk then. I like to contrast the myth about a certain event to the reality. Now, a myth, don't get me wrong, a myth is not a lie. Myths, it's wrong to think of a myth as simply wrong, lies. No. Myths are stories, and sometimes very good stories, very well done stories, whether they are written in books or they're done in a movie, well done stories, around historical themes. And the stories contain a lot of facts that are undeniable. But it's the interpretation of the facts and the omission of certain facts and the emphasizing of other facts that are sometimes not as important as they are presented to us That is what creates a myth, right? And the myths were something that when I mention the word myth, people think of ancient Greek mythology. And indeed, the Greeks were very strong in creating myths as well. And the Greek myths also had a nucleus of historical reality in them. For example, the story of Odysseus and the Odyssey is about the travels of this hero across the Mediterranean back and forth. We now know that this actually is a reflection of the historical exploration by the Greeks of the entire Mediterranean Sea, all the way to from Greece, from what is now Turkey, the borders, the shores of Turkey and the Black Sea, all the way to the shores of Spain and even beyond Gibraltar to the beginnings of the Atlantic Ocean. So there's a lot of myths like that. They had some historical reality, but they were not meant to actually give an accurate picture of reality. The purpose of a myth is to actually socialize people, is to convey an idea that will make people feel good. So the kind of history that I'm dealing with all these myths is kind of a feel-good history. The intention is to convince people, the readers, the viewers, that of a certain kind of a concept, a certain idea. An idea, for example, to talk about what has been singing about, that the war is justified. It was necessary. It may be tough, it may be awful, but you know what? We had to do it. The war was a good war. That's why I called my book, the Second World War, The Myth of the Good War. The war was not a good war. It was a bad war. It was good for some and not so good for others. And this is where, again, I want to respond to what Rod was singing about there in his last song. I was paying attention, Rod, and you asked me what I was going to say about it. To me, it seems to reflect the idea of the military-industrial complex benefiting from wars, big time. And that is one of the reasons, really, why we've had so many wars in the Western world, United States in particular. Many wars, actually, even like the Afghanistan war now, 20 years of warfare, and it has led to nothing in a way. It's a waste of money. Well, yes and no, because for some people, it was a wonderful war. If you were a weapons manufacturer, that was 20 glorious years. You made a lot of money in the process. And you didn't go over there to do the dying, and the killing. No, you stayed home, basically, and you just basically counted your money as you went to the bank. The ones that went over there and came back, they're the losers, but they were winners in this war. Wars, unfortunately, are good for business. It's a sad story. And I write somewhere in one of my books that if peace, God forbid, if peace would break out on earth, imagine that, would be catastrophe in many ways for the stock market. The stock market would collapse, undoubtedly. I mean, if peace would break out tomorrow, it'd be a catastrophe for the economy of the Western world, and particularly the U.S. economy. So think about that sometimes. These are the kinds of things that I write about. So my aim is to demolish myths, and I want to demolish myths, and particularly about the topic of wars and revolutions. And the big theme of history is actually in modern times, is the history of democracy. And democracy has made progress and also regress. And it's a long and twisting and up and down road, zigzagging road, in the force field between revolution on the one hand and war on the other hand. Because the way I see it and the way I interpret the history of modern times, since the French Revolution, is that revolutions have actually generally contributed to the advancement of the cause of democracy. They've actually furthered the cause of democracy. They have basically pushed the democratization process forward. And wars, generally speaking, have been used as a way, an instrument called a weapon, to actually slow down the advance of democracy, to stop revolutions that are the main vectors of democracy. And when I say revolutions, I mean real revolutions, not fake revolutions, not faux revolutions, not color revolutions. And that's again a problem that we have today now. If you would ask me how do they convey these myths about history? Well, then it's by calling, for example, counter revolutions. And that's what's been happening in recent years, for example. what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall has been presented to us as a revolution in Eastern Europe. Well, I'm sorry, it was a counter-revolution. I read an entire chapter about that in my forthcoming book. I mean, it's of course totally against what we've been told in the media. And for some people, it'll be shocking. But one of my final chapters in my forthcoming book is one on which I argue, and I think convincingly, and some people that have read it think so, that the fall of the Berlin Wall was not a triumph for democracy. It was actually a catastrophe for democracy. And what it brought about and what it accompanied, what it reflected, what it illustrated was not a revolution, but a counter-revolution, actually. Yeah. And that is what you will never get to understand if you settle for the mythology of history and of present-day politics, as it is presented by our politicians, by our media, by Hollywood, and indeed, by most of the celebrated mainstream professional historians that are glorified as the great wise men of historiography. And here I must say that while I have a lot of respect for learned professors at many universities, many of them have written books that I find absolutely, totally wrong. There are books about the First World War, for example. There was a book written about the First World War in which I have a keen interest, and I wrote a book about it called The Great Class War, which tells you something already. There was a book written about it where the author, an Australian historian, must have made a lot of money because his book sold all over. It was promoted big time precisely because it pervades the mythology of what I certainly feel is the mythology of the First World War, namely that the First World War was an accident of history. It was just like one of these things that happened, like a bad hair day, Just 1914, nobody wanted war. Nobody wanted war, neither in Paris, nor in London, nor in Berlin, nor in St. Petersburg. Nobody wanted war. No, nobody wanted war. And certainly the business people didn't want war. No, nobody wanted war. But suddenly, poof, war broke out. War as an accident, on the road of history. And suddenly there it was, a beautiful summer of 1914, and suddenly, boy, dark clouds gather in the sky, and war breaks out. And 4 years of nasty stuff, all because of, tough luck, bad luck, a bad year, 4 bad years, It wasn't like that at all. Also, that book, by the way, is called The Sleepwalkers, in which the author represents things as if all these politicians in Europe, the churches in London, the Emperor Billy, Kaiser Billy in Berlin, Tsar Nicholas in St. Petersburg, as if it's their sleepwalked into the war, stumbled into the war. The reality is that war was wanted. War was wanted in St. Petersburg. War was wanted in Berlin. War was wanted in London. War was wanted in Paris. And you know what? War was wanted in Tokyo, and war was wanted in Washington. But it was a harder sell in the United States, for example. It took a few years to sell the war, And the war was sold on a total lie. The war was sold on a total lie. We all know the story. Wilson came up with the idea that it was a war for democracy, guys. It's going to be a good war. Again, a good war, right? A war for democracy, right? So how could you be against that? I mean, surely not all wars are good wars, but a war against democracy must be a really, really good war. Just as later it'll be a war against fascism. Well, that wasn't a war against fascism either, the Second World War. The First World War actually was a war not for democracy, but it was a war against democracy. And again, to understand then this First World War, and the First World War is actually, you might say, the Germans have a name for it. Well, some German historians have a name for it. They call it the Urkatastrophe des 20. Jahrhunderts. It means the primordial, the original, the great catastrophe of the 20th century. The Urkatastrophe, it has in it that word, the origins, the original catastrophe, the one that would throw a shadow on the rest of the century. And that is certainly true. But it's also true that to understand the First World War, you have to understand the century before. So if I now take modern history as a whole, from 19th century and 20th century together, all the way up to the present time, then you can see how the First World War is kind of in the middle. It's like a hinge. The 19th century leading up to the First World War, and the First World War casting its shadow over the 20th century and all the way to the present. I sometimes call the 19th century was the mother of the First World War. And the First World War was the parent of the 20th century. And to understand all that also, then that brings us to another thought along those lines, and that is that the 19th century itself was a child of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was meant the beginning, the first step in the direction of democracy, of modern democracy. Because I will not get into the topic of democracy in ancient Greece, in Athens and so forth. And indeed, the path, the democratization process in modern times starts with the French Revolution. And my dear friends in the United States, I'm sorry to say that the reason why I don't argue that the democratization process started with the American Revolution, which we all know predated the French Revolution, is that, I'm sorry to say, but I'm not the only one, I read this in notice, the American Revolution was not a real revolution. Because a real revolution means a change of a system, not only a political system, the political layer, but I mean the social, economic realities of the system. That must be overthrown and changed thoroughly to have a real revolution. And revolutions shouldn't be confused with rebellions, for example, or revolts. And here's where the American Revolution was different. The American Revolution was a revolt of a colonial elite against the metropolitan elite in London, England. But I mean, it was not a revolution to improve the life of the kinds of people whose lives ought to be improved by a revolution that brings democracy. And that is what the Greeks call the demos, the people, not the entire people, but ordinary people, ordinarily, human beings, meaning 90%, even 99% of the population, not the elite. The democracy is a system in which the ordinary people have something to say and benefit from the system. That is a democracy. So if you now think about that, if you use that criteria, if you see the idea that a revolution, you must bring about the kinds of changes that will improve significantly the lives of ordinary people, and necessarily at the expense of the elite at the top, the 1% we would say today wouldn't be, So it's the demos means the 99%. So if you're going to have a revolution that changes that, then there's going to be serious benefits. There have to be serious benefits involved for ordinary people, for the demos. Well, as you all know, the demos in the United States and the English colonies on the other side of the Atlantic in the 1780s included lots of people of color, Black people, indigenous people. And for them, that revolution changed, I shouldn't say nothing. Yes, it did change it for the worse. Slavery, as far as I understand, it became chattel slavery, became worse in the United States. And for the indigenous people, the American Revolution was a catastrophe. But it was wonderful for the colonial elite, for the George Washingtons and the Jeffersons and all those guys, right? Anyways, I don't want to talk too much about the American Revolution because you guys know your American history a hell of a lot better than I do. When I came to Canada in 1969, I had to start learning from scratch, not only Canadian history, but also American history. Knew very little about it. I had gone to university in Belgium, but we talked about Belgian history and French history and German history. In the United States, well, you didn't have to learn it. You went to see the movies. You went to see the Hollywood productions. I know about the Americans in the Second World War because I saw that movie, The Longest Day. And the later generation knew about the Americans' role in the Second World War because they saw Saving Private Ryan, right? So I mean, this is what we basically consumed was the mythology, about American history, not the real thing, not the reality of it. By the way, as I mentioned, the myths make you feel good about history. It's the term that it's feel-good history. It makes you feel so good to think that we fought for justice and freedom and blah, blah, blah against the bad guys, and we won, hooray, makes us feel really good. As a kid, I felt really, really good that we always were the good guys, right? And the guys that lost were the bad guys. It was them. When we happened to lose sometimes, it was heroically, because the other guys, there was just too many of them, just too many of them. but eventually we'd come back and we'd beat them after all, and we'd wave the flag again. So a lot of that conventional history is feel-good history, but it's not the reality. So why then would we even want to know reality, if it doesn't make us feel good? Because many people that I talk to, and I explained that the First World War was not a war for, but a war against democracy, and that our so-called wonderful leaders were not nearly as wonderful as we thought, were actually in many ways criminals. That doesn't make people feel good. So I mean, that's why I don't always expect to be well received when I talk about these things, because I'm not a messenger of good tidings in a way. I try to lay bare the reality, and the picture isn't pretty. It's not a feel-good story. It's not a happy story, right? But the advantage of the reality is that it makes us understand. It makes us understand the past. And without understanding the past, we have no clue who we are today and where we are and what the hell we are doing here. And that way we can even begin to think about the future, to plan the future. So the historical reality, getting to know it, may not be a pleasure, it may not be fun, it may not make you feel good, but it's liberating, because you can begin to understand your past. That's like a human being who has no memory and suddenly has recall. Wouldn't you be happy? Maybe this person will recall will not always be wonderful, but it's a hell of a lot better to have a memory than not to have a memory. Because without memory, we are lost as an individual. Without memory, without historical memory, we are lost as a society. Now, I want to ask Dean, how am I doing time-wise here? Because I keep talking and I still have some time. All right, good, because I don't want to, overstay my welcome, so to speak. So I was mentioning how then, unfortunately, in some ways, I could not pinpoint the American Revolution, so-called revolution, as the beginning of the democratization process in modern times. Is the French Revolution, because the French Revolution changed not only the political, layer on top of the social economic reality, it brought about major changes in the social economic reality. Now, when I say then that, what I'm saying is that the French Revolution was the first step in the direction of democracy, right? The first step in modern times. And now it's 200 years later. I remember being in Paris in 1989 on the anniversary, 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. It's now another 30 years later. What's the situation with democracy now? Well, we've made headway, no doubt about it. But it has not been a rectilinear, sort of straightforward march forward for democracy. And I have news for you. We ain't there yet, okay? We ain't there yet. What we have now in the United States, you in the United States, we in Canada, throughout the Western world, is not democracy, right? Sorry again, make you feel good. It's not democracy. We are told we are democracy, but we are not a democracy. And actually, I didn't invent this myself. I mean, I've come to the conclusion myself already. But there's a serious study done by a team of professors at one of the Ivy League universities in the States, maybe in Boston, even from what I can recall. And it's just clearly that they did a study, and all indicators are that the United States today is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy. An oligarchy is the rule of a few rich, powerful families. The Bushes, the Kennedys. I mean, you people may know these people. I don't, but it could be your neighbors for all I know. Maybe they're members of the church. I don't know, right? But I mean, it's an oligarchy, and actually, they are described also as a plutocracy, because it's a small elite of very wealthy and powerful people that rule the country. And the fact that you have elections, folks, I mean, that means very, very little. That's a formality. So the idea that we have democracy, it's first of all, it's only a political definition, and it usually asks the question: do you have elections, free elections? Okay, good. Then you have democracy. If you have more than one party, right? If you have one party, that's bad. Two parties, fine. Give me a break. I mean, we in Canada have three parties. Well, does that make Canada more democratic than the United States, where there's only, for practical purposes, only two parties? Or for that matter, in Belgium, where there's 25 parties, I mean, many people still don't bother to vote because they know that these elections don't mean all that much anyways, My conclusion after studying the history of democracy since it took its first steps, since the first steps towards democracy, still an ideal in the future, a utopia that we can sort of not even see clearly in the distance. That first step was taken with the French Revolution, that's true. And there's been more steps taken forward, but there's also been moments when the democratization process was arrested and even pushed back, rolled back. And the road has not been rectilinear, straight up. It's been zigzagging up and down, And while we've made progress, while certainly France today, the Western world today, is more democratic than it was in the past, to say now that we have democracy is a great exaggeration. It just simply isn't true. We're not there yet. But we have, in many ways, the appearances of democracy. We have what I call in my book pseudo-democracy. I mean, fake democracy, faux democracy, pseudo-democracy, so I call it pseudo-democracy, with the trappings, the style of democracy, but not much of the substance. And let me give an example again, because we are talking about wars here, and Don Rodgers maybe want to sing a song about it again, who knows? I mean, most of these wars that the United States and Canada and the Western world has been involved in, were they decided on in a democratic way at all? It's my understanding that the United States, it's the Constitution stipulates that Congress decides on war or peace. But it seems to me that lots of countries have been bombed by the United States in recent years without war being declared at all, simply because the decision was made and the orders were given. Where? Well, in the Pentagon somewhere, in the White House directly. I mean, a warfare, which is a very, very serious business, should be somehow subjected to some democratic controls or decision making, but somehow isn't. Let me say one more thing about democracy, and that is that democracy is like the Roman god Janus, Janus, who gave his name to the month of January. And actually, yesterday was the 1st of January. That's the day of Janus. He has an old face looking back. That's the past year. He has a new young face like mine, looking forward into the new year, right? Well, democracy is like that too. Democracy has two faces. The face that we are supposed to focus on all the time is the political face. And that is where we are in the procedural phase. It's like democracy is free election and lots of parties. Oh yeah, the more the merrier, but 2 is good enough. But 1, bad news. 1, it's just not democracy. 2, democracy. Give me a break. And then the decision making, once you've voted for somebody, and these guys do what they want for 4, 5, 6 years until you can vote again. Here in Canada, for example, a lot of people aren't very happy with the present Prime Minister Trudeau. And the alternative is to vote for the Conservative Party, which was in power before, and many people were not happy with them and voted for Trudeau. So now that you're no longer happy with Trudeau, you can vote for the Conservatives again. I mean, hello, haven't we learned yet? No, that's the choices you have, It's like Tweedledum or Tweedledee. And if you're tired of Tweedledum, you can have Tweedledee again. Tweedledum, you had enough of him, Tweedledum is back, Is that democracy? Quite honestly, hello, it doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to do much for me, that's for sure. So there's the political idea of democracy. And certainly there's something to be said for elections. I'm not against elections. And there's something to be said for certain types of elections. For example, direct elections as opposed to indirect elections, which you in the United States still have for your presidential elections, I believe, isn't it? Is that right? You vote for voters. You don't vote for the candidate, right? And so that's not very democratic. We have in Canada a very undemocratic electoral system called the first past the post, the single member constituency, which favors the big established parties, and small parties have no chance. Much more democratic would be proportionate representation. We don't have that. Trudeau, to get elected some years ago, said he would introduce it. And no sooner was he elected, he said, forget it, we're not going to do it because it's too democratic. It's just too democratic to the tastes of the ruling elite, you might say. By the way, the idea that people of members of our elites love democracy. For example, the Queen of Britain or the Pope, that they love democracy. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. They despise democracy, and they have to, because if you're the leader of an organization like the Catholic Church, I mean, like I was brought up Catholic, I know a bit about it. You know? I mean, the Pope makes all the decisions. What he says is the law. You know? I mean, and any ordinary people. I have a sister who's a nun, and she has nothing to say. They can't even vote for a cardinal. That's everything is top down, right? The idea that Pope John Paul II was a champion of democracy, went to Poland to bring back democracy, is outrageously absurd. I mean, if he wanted to do something for democracy, he could have started right in the Vatican. He could have started right in the Catholic Church, but he didn't. And then he liked democracy in Eastern Europe, yes, but he did not like it in Central America, did he? And El Salvador has come up there, believe Dean, right? I mean, how good was the Pope for the liberation theologists in El Salvador? He hated them, right? In fact, he had many of them murdered together with Spartan.
Nicaragua is where he was just totally the Polish Pope against anything that smacked of the people.
So why was he for democracy?
Including his own priests who
that's right
took part in that revolution.
That's right. Priests and nuns massacred, right? So why was he for democracy in Poland, and why was he against democracy in Central America? I tell you right now why. In Poland, democracy, the bringing back of democracy, meant that the lands of the church, the huge amount of real estate that had been confiscated, nationalized, socialized by the communists in 1945 in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in all over in Hungary, could be recuperated by the Catholic Church. And it has been recuperated by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is today, now thanks to the fall of the Berlin Wall, thanks to the work of John Paul II, is now again the greatest landowner, the biggest landowner in Poland and all over Eastern Europe. Thank you very much. You're doing very well. But in Central America, there was no such advantage involved in bringing in democracy, because the Catholic Church has been a great landowner ever since the Spaniards stole the land of the indigenous people and gave it to the church, didn't they? And to their own nobility, right? So in Central America, democracy would be a threat to the Catholic Church, because any revolutionaries like Sandinistas or other such revolutionaries may well decide to do what the Soviets did, what the communists did in 45 Eastern Europe. That is to say, socialize, nationalize the enormous wealth of the Catholic Church. And that raises the question, of course, how did the church get all that land in the first place?
You went mute. Jacques, you went mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know how this happened. I was just saying how the French, I was asking the question, how did the Catholic Church and how did large landowners in general in Central America and Eastern Europe, how did they get all that land? Did it fall out of the sky with a label attached? Was it delivered by UPS? This is for you. This is a present from the man up there. You can have this. No, it was the fruit of conquest, of bloody conquest in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe as well, because it was the Crusaders, the Teutonic Knights, and other Crusaders in the Middle Ages, who actually went out to conquer Eastern Europe and teach those pagans good manners and a good religion on Christianity. So that is what happened over there. That is why essentially the Pope was all for democracy in Eastern Europe, because it meant he could get the land back, right? So, but the idea that the Pope would be in favor of democracy, or for that matter, the Queen would be in favor of democracy, or any members of what we now often call the 1% would be in favor of democracy is ridiculous, because they know damn well that in democracy that the majority are going to have power, and they would rather have the power in the hands of themselves, which is a minority. So democracy then is not only political, it also has a social side, meaning that a democracy is a system in which the demos, that is to say the majority of ordinary people, the French say ceux d'en bas, those below, can provide some input into the system via elections, preferably based on universal suffrage, and without the first past the post system and direct elections and so on, right? But also it's also a system whereby the state, the system, the democratic system, provides some protection and services and assistance to ordinary people who needed a hell of a lot more than the elite who already have everything. Right? So that means that a democratic system is one where ordinary people cannot only vote and participate in power, but also get certain benefits. We call it social services. We call it, for example, the right to be employed at a decent wage, the right to a pension, the right for women to have certain services so they can look after their children and still get a job. All these things, that's very, very important. If you then look at that, then, in Eastern Europe, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, they had all that. And now, poof, it's all gone. And by the way, in many countries like the United States, those social services are very, very basic, very minimal. And the only place where these social services were really, really elaborate was in the so-called welfare system that arose after the Second World War, in Britain and Western Europe in general, right? With almost full employment and good wages, and pension plans and the whole works, right? But no sooner did the wall come down than that was being dismantled. And it's still being dismantled. Well, we're getting rid of the welfare state. So actually, ever since the wall came down, the cause of democracy has gone downhill big time. I just want to mention, I was going to mention before I had cut myself off here, my audio, was that I was asking the question how the Catholic Church had become the owner of so much land in Central America, and for that matter in Eastern Europe. And that reminded me of a saying by the great French author Honoré de Balzac, who has written something, and maybe this is the way I can finish my talk here. Behind every great fortune, there hides a crime. And you know what? There's a lot of truth to that. The great fortunes of capitalists, to call them that, today in the Western world, there's a lot of crimes that are hidden. Slavery, for example. Slavery was a huge crime that made some people very, very rich. And how about the opium trade in China? That made a lot of people very rich. I learned recently that the family of Franklin Roosevelt, made his fortune in the opium trade, forcing the Chinese, to buy opium, which they didn't want and which was awful for them. But the British and then Americans shoved it down their throats, essentially. And of course, some of people became very rich. The word, the expression was mentioned here earlier of war profiteers, an issue that became big during the First World War. And if I remember what Dean said that your church originated in the context of protests against war profiteering in the First World War. Is that correct, Dean? And that war profiteering meant that a lot of people became very rich during the war. So a lot of the great wealth that we have today is based on past huge crimes like slavery, opium trade, and wars. Wars have been great for two purposes. And one is for the accumulation of wealth. Wars have always made some people very rich while making other people very poor. Warfare is a way to redistribute the wealth. Take it from the poor and give it to the rich. 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan have made you Americans and us Canadians poor because the cost of the war is borne by all the taxpayers in the United States and by us in Canada, all the participating countries that were invited, okay? But the war generates profits. So while the costs have been socialized at our expense, nationalized if you want, the profits have been privatized for the benefit of the arms manufacturers and all the people who make sweetheart deals with the war machine that for 20 years did a wonderful job then generating wealth, wealth for some, for the few, in poverty, for the many, for the poor. So this is one way in which wars are good. They generate money, but wars are also good for something else. War is the antithesis to revolution. In my history of the 19th, 20th century, I talk a lot about the dialectic between war and revolution. And with dialectic, I mean, dialectic, it's a big word, isn't it? But it's not difficult to understand. It's the opposite, or not the opposite, an alternative to causal relationships. A causal relationship presents things as if this causes that, all right? So the war is caused by that. So, but it's actually the other way, it's more complex than that. The cause influences the effect, but the effect then also has an impact on the cause, a feedback process. So the dialectic means it's one influences the other. It's not a coincidence that the French Revolution, which was a great vector for democratic progress, resulted in a series, almost endless series of war, now mostly known as the Napoleonic Wars, isn't it? And that is not a coincidence, because war was used to stop the revolution and to roll back the revolution and to basically end the revolution. Napoleon was a great warrior who ended the revolution, all right, at a certain point. So it's a bit more complicated than say. But typically then, warfare was deliberately used actually as a way to stop a revolution. And I give you an example. In the revolution, the French Revolution was a class war, a civil war within France. And the revolutionaries par excellence were the ordinary yokels in Paris, the sans-culottes, as they call them, right? They're the ones who stormed the Bastille, and they stormed the royal palace, right? And they kept on basically achieving great revolutionary deeds. They were a problem, and the war provided the solution, because it stuffed them into uniforms, and off they went all the way to Moscow. And some of them never came back. And in Paris, they could breathe easily again. Paris became a bourgeois, happy Paris without those potential revolutionaries. You know, the revolutionaries are outside, and they come into Paris to cause trouble. It's happening today, by the way, what has been happening, the green vests, you know about that, right? Anyways, so warfare was used to stop the revolution, prevent the revolution from becoming more radical, and for bringing in more democracy than the elites wanted. And that's why warfare and the military are so useful for that. And that's why later on in the 19th century, the whole history of the 19th century is a history of revolutions and war. Revolutions of 1848, for example, followed by wars, snuffed in the butt by warfare, by armies marching in from Vienna and from Moscow, you know, to snuff out a revolution in Poland and so on. And conversely, wars also triggered revolutions. Okay, so revolutions triggered wars to stop the revolutions. But warfare then has its own way of triggering revolutions, because warfare is when the ordinary people suffer the most. I mean, it's not a belief, if I remember well, it wasn't George W. Bush and Clinton who went to fight in Vietnam, right? It was Hispanics and it was Black Americans who did most of the nasty fighting, because the elites, they don't get involved. They don't do the dying and the dirty stuff and the killing. No. They're above all that, right? So somebody else will do that. They can handle that, right? So the wars are used are good to stop the revolution, and they're good for in that way. But they also cause hardship, misery, losses, bloodshed for ordinary people. They're the ones who suffer. This happened in the First World War, by the way. And this happened in any war. Warfare pauperizes and immiserates people. And that is, as Marx said, that is what pushes people to make a revolution. Okay, so if I have a war, it makes people so miserable that they say enough of it, and they have a revolution. And that's what happened in the First World War. The First World War actually was a war that was planned to avoid revolution and to stop this nonsense with democracy. That's why, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, that's why the elites in St. Petersburg, in Berlin, in Paris, in London wanted a war, because they were afraid that the alternative to war was not peace. No, it was a revolution. And the idea that I read in history books, in one of the best-selling history books of the First World War, that the war was not, that bankers and the industrialists did not want war, they preferred peace. And that's true, they preferred peace. But as they saw it on the eve of 1914, they were not so much worried about peace, they were worried about the possibility of revolution. Revolution was in the air. So the choice, as far as they were concerned, was not between war and peace. Everybody wants peace rather than war. Well, except when you make money on war. But it was between war and revolution. And there they preferred war over revolution. And they were so worried that if the war wouldn't come fast enough, that revolution might win that race. And that would mean the end of their world. But warfare would mean the end of the revolution. So that is how, again, how I present this whole dialectic of war and revolution as the driving force, so to speak, of history in the 19th century. And you know what? It's continued like that in the 20th century. Because while the First World War was a war that was supposed to chase away once and for all the specter of revolution and stop the democratization process and even roll it back as far as possible, which they did during the war. Right? In fact, it's one of the ironies of history. I love the ironies of history, that the war, the great counter-revolutionary project, produced a great revolution in Russia. And to avoid similar revolutions, which were a very real possibility in Britain and France and in Germany, elsewhere, the major concessions had to be made in terms of democratic reforms of a political as well as social nature, such as the introduction of the 8-hour day, for example, in France, and as the introduction of universal suffrage in other countries. Because the idea that all these countries like France, Belgium, Britain were democracies in 1914, that's another myth, So these are the kinds of myths that I talk about. But what happened then is that after the First World War, the project had failed. The great counter-revolutionary and anti-democratic project had produced a great revolution and more democracy than ever before. Now you could say, well, c'est la vie, so the elites, they've gambled and they lost. C'est la vie. No, history always goes on and on and on. The elites did not say, well, we lost, too bad, so sad. No, they said, we got to do something about it. No sooner had they made the concessions towards democracy, they were thinking of ways to roll it back. And now the problem of revolution was still there, because before the First World War, revolution was an abstract concept, a great fear, of course, with historical antecedents, such as the revolutions in France and the Paris Commune and so on. But after the First World War, the word had been incarnated, so to speak. The revolution was now a country, the Soviet Union, representing the revolution and promoting the revolution. And guess what? The nerve those commies had. They promoted the revolution not only within the capitalist countries, but in our very own colonies. Now imagine that. How wicked can they be, right? So of course we hated those guys. And what are we going to do about it? Well, we got to exterminate this nest of revolutionaries. So it's a dirty job, but somebody's going to do it. And who's going to do it? The guy with the mustache, Hitler. So fascism was the solution that the elites came up with, having lost ground, so to speak, as a result of the Russian Revolution and the way that the war ended, having been forced to introduce more democracy, and having now been created a new revolutionary monster in the shape of the Soviet Union, they now created another monster. They created a Frankenstein monster, namely fascism, to fight democracy, which it did successfully almost all over Europe, and also destroy communism, which all the fascist systems did domestically. And the great fascist, number one, Hitler, took it upon himself to destroy the system, the revolutionary system in the Soviet Union. And that is why in London and Paris, they supported Hitler. The so-called policy of appeasement was not at all to avoid a war. No, it was to encourage Hitler to move east. Go east, young man, instead of go west, young man. Go east, march east. And that was the idea, encouraging Hitler to march to direct the military might of Germany towards the Soviet Union and finish off the job over there. Well, I think I've talked enough, haven't I, Dean? I think I'm going to stop here. Is that all right? Because there's lots more we could talk about. And
Yes.
actually, I believe Rod wanted to talk about Hiroshima, but I'll just stop here. Maybe now there'll be some questions. I don't know.
And we'll have an opportunity for a rich conversation. Thank you, Jacques.
You're welcome.
There's so much there, and any one of you who would like to watch it again, go to our YouTube channel and take it in. There's so much, as there is in this vast library of books that we have here to complement what Jacques has just said. And on the subject of books, Jacques, tell us where the best place that's not Amazon to get some copies of your books.
Yeah.
Is there
Well,
just one publisher or?
well, my
or
publisher,
several?
of the English editions of my books have been published right here in Canada by an outfit called James Lorimer in Toronto. And they have a distributor in the United States. And I wish I
Okay.
could remember the name now. It's actually a distributor of mostly military history books. But if you go to the website of James Lorimer, so if you Google Lorimer, Lorimer,
Lorimer.
yeah, Lorimer, James Lorimer, but actually just Lorimer, and then Pauwels, my last name,
All right.
and say put in Lorimer Jacques Pauwels, then you'll end up at the website of, and I think it'll give you information where in the States you can get the books. But I know I avoid Amazon as much as I can, of course, also. But I use an outfit called AB Books, ABE.books.
Yes.
And they're an international organization, and they have suppliers all over the place. I get books from Germany, France, and their postal rates are pretty decent too. And they often have secondhand books as well. So they're like a lesser version of Amazon. So you may want to try AB Books, ABE Books.
Did somebody tell me that they're owned by Amazon now?
You know what?
It's hard to keep up with that
Yeah,
stuff.
probably soon
Anyway,
they'll own everything.
Jacques, thank you so much, and let's finish out. This is my moment to say to everybody, help us keep Community Church alive in 2022 and deep into the future by making a contribution at our website, which is communitychurchofboston.org. You can do a credit card or you can do a PayPal. You can also do what many do, which is make a recurring contribution. Be it $10 a month, be it $5 a month, whatever you like. That's the way we keep this building maintained. We keep this auditorium for the People's Forum and for organizing. That's the little tiny money pitch that we always make right at this moment before we invite Rod MacDonald for one last song. And we're just so grateful, Rod, that you can be with us today. Join him tonight on his Facebook page or website. You can find out about the Christine Lavin's birthday party that he's involved in tonight with a whole bunch of other great players. Take it away, Rod.
Thanks, Dean. Just before I start, let me mention the event you're talking about is called the Greenwich Village Folk Festival, and I'm trying to get a little more light here without blinding myself. The Greenwich Village Folk Festival is a monthly online free concert, and if you'd like to see tonight's show, it's at it's on Facebook. Just look for Greenwich Village Folk Festival. We also have it's streamed to greenwichvillagefolkfestival.org and to YouTube, any of those things. Jacques, I'm sorry?
When?
Oh, it's on at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, 7 to 10. And some of the other performers are definitely worth mentioning. Art Podell from the Old New Christy Minstrels. Scott Ainsley, your fellow New Englander, who's a very excellent political singer-songwriter, in addition to being a real scholar of the blues. David Roth, who you probably know, a really fine singer-songwriter. And Sister Kate Taylor, younger sister of James and Livingston, and Christine Lavin herself. And I'm in the concert. Also Greg Greenway, who's one of the really fine singer-songwriters out there these days. So it's going to be a great concert. Jacques, I was reading this summer Burr by Gore Vidal, which is, of course, a novel, and I don't know to what degree historically it's accurate or not. But one of the interesting things that struck me about it was a scene in which there's an off-year election between presidential elections, and when the Federalists begin to lose, they start rioting in New York, and they go around to various democratic businesses that they know support and newspapers that support Jefferson and Burr and people like that. That's not me, is it? No. And no, it's not me. And
Sorry.
and they start stoning and bombing, stoning and throwing, 1820s versions of fire bombs through windows and things like that. And of course, Vidal wrote this book, I believe, in the 1980s or 90s. So it's not written in the context of today's politics, but it certainly shows that the idea of I don't know what you'd call it, democracy versus, let's say, patriotism, has a mixed side to it. That for many years, many of us who have opposed wars fought by the United States, the very first thing that you always get accused of is being unpatriotic. But in fact, many people, I think, oppose wars and other endeavors of the kind out of a truer form of patriotism, out of a desire that their country represent its own ideals better. Just to toss that out there. Anyway, here's a song that, as the year approaches, one of Dean's announcements seemed to be kind of relevant to me. Hey, if I were you, I'd lay those weapons down. Go home to your pastor, your minister, your priest, your wife, your partner, your mistress, and at least beg forgiveness for the harm you've done. Now, what did you think was going to happen? And if you don't watch out, your fantasies will come true. You'll find yourself and your friends in a shootout with people all dressed in blue. Is that really why you came? To give patriotism a bad name? You're training in the mountains, you're marching on maneuvers, you're intending to do some harm. Are you so oppressed by this democracy, you need to walk around fully armed? And you're doing this why? You shut the hell up, said the man in the center. What are you, some kind of wise ass? No, I'm just a concerned citizen. In the distance, they heard sirens as they all stood there in silence. Hey, now if I were you, I'd lay those weapons down. Go home to your pastor, your minister, your priest, your wife, your partner, your children, your mistress, and at least beg forgiveness for the harm you've done. And don't forget how you came to give patriotism a bad name. Don't forget how you came to give patriots a bad name. Well, simple tune for present day thinking.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome,
Yeah.
Dean. It's
Rich.
thank you so much for the invitation to join you folks. I don't usually get up on Sunday mornings, but I love hearing these speakers and what I learned from them. Jacques, thank you so much for your comments and wisdom.
Well, again, Rod, thanks so much. And we'll drop everything for the next time you are in town physically, and we'll get you back virtually as soon as we can. I want to just take this chance to do our little ritual here, which I forgot to do earlier on. It's very short, and it's from this book, Eduardo Galeano, Children of the Days, and it has one entry for each day of the year, and we get to start the book over because it's January again, and this one is from January 2nd. It's called From Fire to Fire. On this day in 1492, Granada fell, and with it fell Muslim Spain. Triumph of the Holy Inquisition, Granada was the last Spanish kingdom where mosques, churches, and synagogues could live side by side in peace. That same year, the conquest of America began, when America was still a mystery without a name. And in the years that followed, in distant bonfires, the same flames would consume the books of Muslims, Jews, and of America's indigenous peoples. Fire was the only fate for words born in hell. The Gospel according to Eduardo Galeano for our Church of Community Boston. Praise be. Thank you, Galeano. Now we have 29 people on the Zoom call, and we have the YouTube chat section. Anyone who would like to have a word or a question for Jacques, this is your chance. And we start with our tech guru, Charlie himself. Go ahead and unmute, Charlie.
I have a question.
Hi, I enjoyed the talk. One of the things that's, I've read several people talking about this subject, about the end of World War I, that Germany really wasn't, they were still occupying France, they were in a stronger position, and what really happened was there was a serious prospect of a revolution in Germany, and the ruling classes on each side decided to call off the war to prevent a revolution in Germany. I was wondering if I could get your take on that.
Can I answer that question? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure. Yes, it certainly was a factor. In fact, the German army was still in much of France, in northern France, and in Belgium, when the Germans command decided to surrender. And indeed, they could have continued, but they had a greater concern, and that was the revolution within the country. So that they wanted to turn their attention to that. And that was also very much in the interest of the Allied leaders, military as well as political, because of course there was a revolution in full swing in Russia, where they actually were sending troops already to put down the Bolsheviks. Few people know about that, but the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Belgium all sent troops already to intervene in the civil war in Russia. So that was a major concern. And of course, at that stage, there was a very serious and justified fear that the revolution might spread from Russia and Germany, where it was going full blast, and Hungary to the rest of Europe. In fact, our history books remain silent about that because it's a bit of a painful topic, but there were quasi-revolutionary situations in France, in Belgium, in Britain at the end of the war, and mutinies and fraternizations galore. So the idea was to stop this war with Germany, and focus on containing the spreading confronting this revolutionary danger, either with weapons or, if necessary, by quickly making concessions, as happened. I explained that, how that also served to defuse the revolutionary threats at that time. So yes, the answer is absolutely right. It was a big deal. And in fact, part of the armistice conditions that the Germans agreed to was actually, and the Allies insisted on, was that in Eastern Europe, where the German army still had lots of units occupying countries like the Baltic countries, for example, that the Germans over there did not have to lay down their arms, because that would have been to the advantage of the Bolsheviks, but instead were allowed to continue fighting as long as they were fighting the Bolsheviks. until then the British and the French would have a chance to bring in troops of their own, which is partly what happened, actually. Yes, so definitely the Russian Revolution was very much on the minds of the victors as well as the losers, the German losers in that fall of 1918. In fact, throughout 1918 already, but especially then in the fall as the war dwindled down, came to an end, it was decided to hurry it up so that we could turn to the other business. That's much more urgent. Yes.
Thanks, Jacques. We have a question from Carolyn, who's right here with me in the audience. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Thank you. I'm probably more concerned with what's going on today, and I'd like you to comment on the idea that COVID is a war on the flu, and essentially it's impoverished and killed a great percentage of our people, and it has contributed to the decline in healing. And that's personal healing, healing the country, healing everything. And the second is the war on climate change, which they went to, I guess Biden went to COPs to try and work on the treaty, and he comes back and he leases more petroleum, gives more leases to petroleum companies.
Yeah.
So that war is not only military war, but it's war on healing, and it's war on climate, and that is the war on women as well. And you can see that in the anti-abortion things.
Yeah.
So that I would just expand what you said to women's issues, which are healing, climate, and our rights.
Yeah. Well,
women's rights, which extend to men, but
yeah.
I know we did a Julian Assange standout on New Year's Eve, and it was mostly women were very well represented there.
Yeah. Yes, well, thank you for a very interesting question. Now, I am less qualified to comment on happenings today. As an historian, I'm always looking more inclined to look back. That doesn't mean that I'm not following what's going on. In fact, what I mentioned in my new book, in the last chapter, I mentioned COVID, the COVID crisis, and I mentioned that the whole COVID situation is in fact similar to a war, the war against COVID. I mean, there's lots of wars now that are different from the conventional military warfare, for the war on drugs, for example. But the war on COVID is a war that also, like the other wars that we've all been involved in recently, is when a system to redistribute the wealth, make the rich richer and the poor poorer. That is certainly happening with COVID. For example, the pharmaceutical companies are making millions and millions and millions of dollars, and big companies are taking advantage of the situation, whereas the small enterprises, small businesses are being squeezed out of business. So essentially, you might say that it's a war again, whereby the big shots profit big time, whereas ordinary people suffer big time. And so that's one thing. So the COVID is a kind of war, which, like military wars, and which makes the rich richer. It makes them well off, much better off, and the poor much worse off. But also another function of wars is to discipline the plebes, is to discipline the demos as in democracy. That is to say, to generate less democracy rather than more democracy. During wars, one of the advantages of war was always that, sorry guys, it's warfare now, so no more nonsense, no protests, no strikes, no demands for higher wages, none of that. It's all for the common good. We have to be tough. The French say, à la guerre comme à la guerre, meaning we have no patience during war. And of course, anybody who's not doing as he or she is told is a traitor and can be locked up in jail, like as was the case with pacifists through the First World War, with lots of people. So during war, there's no tolerance, and therefore there's also no room for ordinary people to express themselves and to participate in to say anything at all. So wars serve this function. They facilitate the accumulation function, you might say, that benefits the rich and works to the disadvantage of poor. And it also disciplines, and basically further undermines an already weak democratic system, which, as I mentioned, is not really democracy. It's a faux democracy. It's a pseudo democracy. So it works to the advantage of especially now COVID, of the great big pharmaceutical companies. And that also means it also works here in Canada, especially to undermine the existing health system and provide less service at higher cost. And there's a lot of people now who cannot get treatment for whatever ails them because it's all COVID. And so COVID becomes an excuse for giving less service. Here in Canada, we've always been proud of our pretty good health system. But now it's virtually impossible to go see a doctor because the doctor doesn't want to see you anymore. You gotta call them. They're gonna call you back. Sometimes they call you back a week later, and then they make a diagnosis over the phone, which is, of course, almost ridiculous. So that the service we are getting, the health service, has been deteriorating big time, and I don't see the end of that in sight. So that indeed the COVID crisis is also a way to dismantle, one of the big achievements of social democracy in Canada, which was a pretty decent healthcare system, and it's still decent. But my feeling is that the COVID crisis is an opportunity to attack, to challenge, to undermine that system. And that involves caregivers, of which a great majority are women now, and who are made to work harder. I remember only a few days ago, there was a protest by nurses because they were saying that doctors, typically more male, now also more increasingly female, but doctors were paid extra for doing extra work in the context of COVID, but the nurses were supposed to do it all for free. And of course, that again is a way in which, of course, women were paying the price for COVID as opposed to men. So yes, I agree with the comments that you just made in general, and like I say, I made that point in my book as well. But of course, the story of COVID is an ongoing thing, and who knows what else will come down the pipe. But while I'm not an anti-vaxxer or anything like that, I certainly have my doubts about the legitimacy of all these measures and of whatever our governments are doing or not doing or neglecting in the process, such as decent services and so forth. So it is a problem. It is indeed a war, again, a war waged against ordinary people. Yep.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thank you, Carolyn. I just noticed a comment from Alvin Foster, who says, in North America, ending slavery was indeed a revolution, to which Joan Livingston replied, and that was when, Alvin, ? Not the Civil War, ongoing. And it leads me to something that I was talking to Charlie about on New Year's Eve, and I also saw in an editorial column in the Boston Banner, which is African-American owned newspaper here in Boston, where they're talking about the American Revolution as basically an effort to keep slavery, to maintain slavery, because the British were in the process of already banning slavery, and slavery was a very lucrative, profitable thing, both for South and North here in the United States, and that is what the revolution was really about, not about lofty stuff that these founding fathers talked about, who were all super rich dudes and lots of them slave owners. What do you think of that, Jacques?
Well, I know slavery is one thing, and indeed, I mentioned how the heroes of the American Revolution were the elite, the colonial elite, and they were slaveholders for sure, and they would never have dreamed of changing that. I mean, it was unthinkable for them. Slaves were a form of property, right? But it's also it was not a revolution, then a real revolution, in the sense that it did not lead to any improvement for another big segment of the population here, and that was the indigenous, the so-called Indians. In fact, the freedom that the likes of Washington and Jefferson wanted was a freedom to do as they pleased with the indigenous people. And that is what bothered them, was London had imposed some restrictions on the expansion of the colonies further west, further encroaching on Indian territories. And London also was grateful to, for example, the Six Nations of New York State for having fought with them on their side against the French in the 7 Years' War. And as a result of that, they protected these people. They protected the Six Nations against the encroachments by the colonists, which is why, of course, the Six Nations fought with the loyalists against against Washington and the revolutionaries, and were kicked out later on, and ended up right here where I live, actually on the Grand River in southern Ontario, is where Joseph Brand, who was the head of the Mohawk Nation of the Six Nations, he was, after being driven out of the newly founded United States in 1785, I think, he came here and he was given land generously by the Crown. In fact, our town of Brantford has the oldest Anglican church in Ontario, which was given by the Crown to Joseph Brand. And I live in Brantford, which is named after Joseph Brand. So the liberty that the American revolutionaries wanted was not liberty for everybody. It was certainly not liberty for the slaves. It also was the liberty for Indians. It was the liberty for the colonists to keep slaves and persecute and exterminate, actually, Indians. A historian I absolutely admire enormously, an Italian historian called Domenico Losurdo, whose books some of his books are available in English, but not too many, has written about all these things, wonderful books. And he emphasizes all this. That was really an eye-opener to me to read about that. But then again, of course, it's not a secret. A lot of people know that. But again, the media, Hollywood, perpetuate the mythology. They perpetuate the myth that the American Revolution was for freedom, for rights for everybody, for the good of mankind. I'm sorry, it ain't so. It wasn't like that at all.
Domenico Losurdo.
Domenico Losurdo, Losurdo.
Oh,
and
surdo.
Surdo, the deaf one.
Lo surdo. Surdo, in Spanish, surdo means left-handed, which is probably comes from the same place.
He's left-handed. Yes.
Like Sinister, right?
Yeah.
Siniestra is left.
Sinister,
yeah, that's funny.
And it's a funny thing. Yeah. It's a funny thing that in Belgium, I have a friend who works at the museum in Flanders Fields. And his name in Flemish is Dominique, which is Domenico in Italian, right? Dundoven, which means exactly the same thing, the deaf one. So Domenico Losurdo in Italy and Dominique Dundoven in Belgium, same name. And he's also an historian and also a bit left-wing, a bit left-wing. Yeah, small world.
Well, we're coming to an end here.
Yeah,
This has been very rich.
Can I get in too?
Sue, who's that?
It's Mary Lynn. I can't get the thing to raise my hand on the.
Okay, so go ahead. We hear you. We hear you, Mary Lynn.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
One more time.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you. I really agree with everything you said, from the American Revolution to the fall of Berlin Wall to the present, wars with no end. And one of the places of pervasive propaganda, I think you mentioned the films. I was thinking also of the revisionist from the truth history that is presented in musicals, everything from Oklahoma to Alexander Hamilton. It's another place where, millions of Americans learn their history, which Roxanne Dunbar, in her latest Not a Nation of Immigrants, her first chapter, if you don't read the whole book, at least read the first chapter, really talks about Alexander Hamilton as an affluent British citizen who's married to the wealthiest and the largest slave owner in the colonies, who was totally I guess, well, maybe it's mostly the petty bourgeoisie and the wealthy who can afford tickets to Alexander Hamilton and get this bunch of lies set to music. But it's going to be penetrating all the public schools. You know, everything from the elementary schools to the high schools are going to be putting on this kind of production. And there's a book that I read that Dean keeps mentioning. Is it The Real History of the United States, or was that Roxanne Dunbar too? It's a big, thick book, Dean, that you keep saying that you just dip into. It's by a male.
Howard Zinn
and
People's History?
No, the latest one that you got before you got Roxanne Dunbar's book. Anyway, he takes, I wish I could, I'm sorry. I've been convalescing for months now with different breaks and bones and stuff, and I'm losing my memory being alone here. But that was one thing I wanted to say. If you had any comment on the way popular entertainment besides movies is penetrating the education system as well as the general population with false accounts of American history. And the other, just a comment, was that I think it was Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz who was talking about how when slavery so-called ended in the United States and in Great Britain, it was more because the places where there was majority population of African slaves were in rebellion, and that was very frightening to the elite in the United States. And so they went heavy into breeding their own slaves, and that's what wasn't really changing. It was safer to keep a minority, population, and to breed your own who had no contact with the mother country. So anyway, if you have anything to say about popular entertainment and the horrible history we're learning from that and this other. Okay, thank you.
You're asking me the question, right? You were asking me the question? Yeah. Well, I don't know much living in Canada. I'm not really much aware of some of the things you talk about, even some of the musicals and the theaters, plays that are important now, that are successful in Broadway. I'm sorry, I'm not affiliated with that. But as you're talking about that in popular entertainment, music obviously comes to mind. And I'm thinking about here in Canada, we have a singer who is now getting a little older. He was actually a buddy of Bob Dylan at one point. So that generation, like some of us, who lived through the 60s and actually remember some of it, and he's got Gordon Lightfoot. Maybe the name rings a bell. In fact, Bob Dylan sang some of his songs composed by Gordon Lightfoot. And I remember when I came to Canada in the 60s, came to Canada in the late 1969, his big hit then he had created in 1967, which was the centennial of the birth of the Canadian state. And it's called the Canadian Railway Trilogy, right? And it's sort of a tribute, to the men who built the railway. That's a staple of Canadian mythology as it is in American mythology, right? The railway, right? It doesn't get much better than that, right? And it's a wonderful song. It really, really is a good song. Look it up on YouTube. Gordon Lightfoot, the Great Canadian Railway Trilogy. It's an absolutely superb song. But if you listen to it, it's bad history because you'd never know that the railway was built basically by slave labor, except we didn't call it slaves anymore. They were called coolies. Because when Britain saw fit to abolish first the slave trade and eventually the slavery itself, it doesn't mean they stopped the practice. They just gave it another name. They actually brought in Chinese and Indian laborers, because there was lots of those around, and that was the coolies, they called them, and there was a coolie system. So wherever there was extra dangerous work to be done as cheaply as possible, you brought in that kind of labor. And by the way, my friend Dundoven in Belgium, who wrote about the First World War, he's just published a book about how Chinese and Indian labor was used in the First World War by the British and the French, especially, cheap labor to be done to basically to solve the problem of the labor shortages due to all the men being at the front, which of course was a solution that Germany didn't have. They had to use other slave labor. So the wonderful song, just I remember the line. It says, "The railway was built for the good of us all." And that's sort of, like,
Yeah.
it rings in my ears when I think of that song. It's meant for the good of us all. It's a very nice thought, Gord, but I mean, it wasn't so, especially if you think about how the land for the railway was given away by the Canadian government, or British government, I guess, parties. So, no, it was Canadian government already. It was given away for free to these big companies that later on became the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Canadian National Railway. Today, these are the giants of Canadian capitalism. So again, they made their fortunes, in a rather suspect sort of a way. We call it a crime if you want, because certainly a lot of these coolies died during the construction of the railway. And when they were done, they were booted out of the country in a hell of a hurry, because nobody wanted Chinese or Indians around too much. That happened in the United States as well, as I understand, right? So sorry, now we don't need you guys anymore, so off you go. Those who are killed, well, they stay here, but the others all go home as fast as possible. And they were paid very little. So yes, that was a kind of form of slavery. So here's a song that was very, very popular and still is. It's one of the, I'm sure if there will be a poll in Canada asking which is the greatest song of the last 20, 30, 50 years, that song would be part of it. It's very well known. And it also conveys the mythology of history.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I mentioned
Wait.
the name of the Ortiz Brook
Lynn.
is not a nation.
Sorry, I didn't know.
That was Jacques, for everybody, as an antidote to the bad history of the Great Canadian Railway trilogy, I urge you to find Gordon Lightfoot's favorite song of mine. It's called Don Quixote.
Oh, Don Quixote, yeah.
Just a beautiful, beautiful song, and I want to learn it.
Okay, there's a good anti-war song of his called Protocol. Rod should be interested in that. Look it up. Gordon Lightfoot, Protocol.
Protocol?
Protocol.
Okay, that
Yes.
sounds great. We have a gentleman.
Been trying to speak.
We have a gentleman that I have put in line. He has his finger up, and I don't know your name, sir. Will you?
Yeah, I'm Rüdiger. Rüdiger? I'm Rüdiger. Here, live of a nice tablet.
Oh, Rudiger.
Yeah, Rüdiger.
Go ahead. Be
yes.
quick, because it's 1
Yeah,
o'clock.
I try to be quick.
Okay.
So I'm German, and I'm victim of what you said, that I thank every older American to fight for the war. Otherwise, we would speak German right now. So so I'm a victim of your talk. Thank you so much for the talk. Wonderful talk. But I think you have a dialectic between revolution and democracy, and I want to give you 3 new ideas, maybe, or 3 things which you might want to reflect. One thing is tribal, to recognize tribal as a legitimate a nation. So, like in Afghanistan, the war would be not there. And 2 big armies failed because of tribal societies. Second is climate change was mentioned. Is not dictatorship the final solution to rescue the human being when it comes to climate change? And the third one is, since you come from Belgium, and I think and Canada, both countries are very famous for one thing: they want to split. What do you think for splitting big countries? And I'm thinking also Quebec, of course, and Wallons from the Flandern. So these are the 3 solutions, maybe solutions for instead of democracy or revolution.
Well,
and I leave it like this.
Yeah. Well, you brought up a number of topics here, Rudiger. And I really don't know where to start. But first of all, Canada and Belgium have the similarity that you have 2 different tribes, if you want, living within one country. The Wallonen, or the Flemish, like me, in Belgium, and the French and in English elements here in Canada. The idea that they want to split is not true. I mean, that is simply not true. I mean, it's true that there are linguistic problems. It's also true that they are highly exaggerated. and manipulated by the powers that be, because divide and conquer is a strategy that Caesar was much aware of and used with great success, and that our dear leaders today are using all the time. Because the greatest fear of an elite of the 1% is that the 99% would come together, because that would be a real threat. And to split them all up, they can basically handle us as long as we're little pieces. But if it's one big puzzle, one big group, they would have great reasons to fear. So basically dividing them on the basis of language or men and women, whatever, blacks versus whites, there's lots of ways in which you can split the demos, the population, the ordinary people, the mass of the people. That is part of the strategy. So in Belgium, for example, it's interesting that a lot of people who vote for the parties that stand for separation don't really want to separate the country, but they vote because that party, it's the same reason why in the United States people voted for Trump, because they are seen to be non-establishment, against the establishment. A lot of people know that the establishment basically is not on our side, they're against us, and they are desperate to basically express their opposition to what's coming from above. As Groucho Marx once said, sometimes people say to me, "Are you a Marxist?" I said, "Yeah, Groucho Marxist." And my favorite line of Groucho Marx is, "Whatever it is, I'm against it." Whatever comes down the pipe from above, please, I say no already. So it's true that a lot of people have that attitude, that they know damn well that their governments are not acting in their interests most of the time, anyways, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, whatever it is they come up with, I'm already suspicious. Whatever reason they give you, if you think back of the reasons that we all had to go to war against Iraq or against Afghanistan, lies. And so we know it already. Whenever our prime minister opens his mouth, I already start assuming that it's lies that's coming out, or BS, right? And that's what people realize, and that's why they vote for what they perceive to be protest parties. And these nationalistic, these separatist parties, both here in Canada and in Belgium, are indeed playing that card. They present themselves as great alternatives to the establishment. Oddly enough, today in Belgium, we have a situation whereby the biggest party now is the Flemish Separatist Party. And they're now in the establishment because they are now actually in the government. So now they have a problem now, because it's hard to project the image of being anti-establishment if you are actually very much part of it. Of course, they have always been. So I really don't think that people really want to separate the country. In fact, I don't think so at all. The other question you raised is, do we need a dictator to solve the climate crisis? Well, that is, of course, a huge question that still a lot of people are still struggling with. Is a dictator the solution? Is a wise man the solution? Is the great white hope sort of idea? The idea that Napoleon was a wonderful savior of France at a time of turmoil. The idea that Hitler looked for a while as the savior and many Germans fell for it, blah, blah, blah. The idea that we need a great leader. Well, we certainly need leadership, but we don't need dictatorship, because the two actually are often confused. I mean, obviously, a dictator is a leader, but not every leader is a dictator. A leader is a dictator when the dictators go against the interests of ordinary people. So a dictator is anti-democratic. But there's no doubt that there are leaders who are democratic, who have come to power and have a lot of power and have used their power, sometimes ruthlessly, but in favor of ordinary people. All right. And this leads me to the first chapter in my book on the myths of modern history is about the French Revolution. And here I contrast the existing mythology about Napoleon with that about Robespierre. Now, Robespierre, you know him? He was the great revolutionary whose name is associated with the guillotine, with la terreur, the policy of terror, of chopping off the heads of the enemies of the revolution and necks, so you could handle lots of executions in one day. It was a mechanized, sort of modern industrial way of executing people. Well, today, or mostly, according to conventional history in France, and according to the media and an idea also propagated by many movies, is that Robespierre was a bloodthirsty monster, a dictator. And Napoleon was a great leader, a wonderful military man who brought glory to the nation, blah, 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 blah. Now, the reality is that Napoleon was a dictator and Robespierre was not. Robespierre had a lot of power, but he actually acted on behalf of the people. And that meant also ruthless action. And I'm sure that undoubtedly some innocent people fell victim to it too. But thorough studies of the terror policy of Robespierre show that most of these victims were not exactly innocent little lambs. They were tough opponents of the revolution and were counter-revolutionaries who, when they had power, actually killed many more people than Robespierre ever did. And if you want to talk about the terror then of Robespierre, of the dictator, what about the terror generated by Napoleon? I mean, they believe that the terror of the revolution associated with Robespierre, this dictator, so to speak, killed about 30,000 people. That's less than 1% of Frenchmen. But how many victims were caused by the wars waged by Napoleon for the glory of France and the glory of the emperor himself? Millions of people, right? Millions of people. If you think about the Schlacht by Leipzig in 1813, most people don't even know about that. You German, you know about the Battle of Leipzig, right? Like 100,000 people killed in 3 days of fighting, right? The Battle of Waterloo, in 1 day of fighting, it's like 80,000 people killed, right? All for nothing, essentially, for nothing, for the glory of Napoleon, right? Now, Napoleon was a dictator, right? Oddly enough, in France today, not a single statue of Robespierre to be seen anywhere. Not a single boulevard or street named after him. Not a museum after him. Napoleon, monuments all over the place. Oh, what a guy, you know what I mean? Like a great hero. Napoleon was a workman. Now, if there would have been a Nuremberg-style tribunal after 1815, Napoleon would have sat on the bench. You would have had to hang him, right? And so he was a dictator. So the term dictator and leader, you have to be a little careful. It's true that to solve some of the problems we're involved in today will require strong leadership. But if that leadership is based on popular consent, if the leaders are produced by the people, by the base, and not parachuted onto the system from above, then we have a chance that we may have what some would call a benevolent dictator. You know, you can argue about semantics here, right? But you know what I'm saying? Like some leaders may seem to be dictators, but they've actually been good for people. But they're still condemned as dictators by those, the elites who have no interest in it, or who saw the disadvantage of them. That's why in France, traditionally, Robespierre is still condemned as a criminal. By the way, talking about Robespierre should have a big statue in the middle of Place de la Concorde in Paris, or as far as I'm concerned, on top of the Eiffel Tower, because he did something which was a major, major step forward for democracy, if not the major step forward for democracy in the history of modern Europe. And most people don't even know what it was. Do you know what it was? Most people have no idea. They think the Robespierre, the guillotine, you know, blood. Robespierre abolished slavery. All right? Slavery is the most undemocratic institution, right? And slavery existed all over Europe. It had existed for thousands of years. Most people don't know that, but the first country in the world to abolish slavery officially was revolutionary France, when France was a radical republic under Robespierre. And now, how many lives did this not save? So why harp about the few thousand counter-revolutionaries that basically were his victims? Why not praise him for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who gained their freedom in a much better life, or at least a prospect of a better life, because he abolished slavery. And guess what? When Napoleon came to power afterwards, he brought slavery back. He brought slavery back. So why do we admire Napoleon? He was a mass murderer who brought slavery back. And why do we condemn Robespierre as a dictator when actually he abolished slavery? And he brought in, by the way, universal suffrage as well. So, I mean, this guy deserves a monument, and those monuments to Napoleon should be torn down. No, I'm against tearing down all these statues, but you know what I'm saying, right? We should not glorify Napoleon too much and demonize Robespierre. It should be the other way around. So yes, there are dictators, there are leaders. Some leaders are dictators, and they are dictators sometimes for some, and wonderful heroes for others. I can think of many other examples. Like for example, take Lenin. Lenin led the revolution in Russia in 1917, and he became popular. He was the leader of a small party, but he got a mass following in no time at all after his return to Russia in the summer of 1917 because of two reasons. Okay, he first of all, he offered to do what the majority of Russians people, 90% wanted. First of all, get out of this god-awful war. Out of that war. We don't want anything to do with that war. Out, out, out. No more war. The war was mass murder, right? And secondly, the people who gave us the war, the Tsarist regime and the aristocracy, that all has to change. We have to change the whole system, including do away with large land ownership by the Orthodox Church and by the Tsarist aristocracy and give the land to the peasants. Right? Now, the provisional government had created under Kerensky in the revolution in March 1917, refused to do that. The only party that said we'll do that was Lenin. So Lenin was swept into power because of overwhelming popular support, because he promised and did what the people in Russia wanted to do, get the country out of the war and socialize land ownership. That was an amazing democratic decision. But guess what? In London, Churchill was very upset. Why is that? Well, Russia out of the war, that's not in our interest. We want Russia to keep on fighting. We want Russians to keep on fighting and dying and bleeding to help us allies win the war, right? Well, the Russians didn't give a fart about that, right? I mean, they wanted this war, this killing, this massacre to end. Russia had already lost 4 million people by 1917. They had enough. So Churchill condemned Lenin as a dictator for giving the Russian people what they desperately wanted. And he is glorified as a Democrat because he wanted to continue the Russian people to keep on dying for a cause which was not theirs. And because of what they did, pulling Russia out of the war, displeased the elite in Britain. All right. So who's the Democrat? Who's the Democrat here? Who's the dictator? Was Lenin a dictator by giving the Russians what they wanted? And was Churchill a wonderful Democrat because he opposed that? I mean, sometimes our history is absurd. Sometimes it's not only what we are dished out is not only myths, it's BS, it's lies, it's distortions of history, major distortions. But of course,
thank you, Jacques.
But of course, Churchill wrote the history, didn't he? When he was asked at one point, history may not be kind to you, Winston. He said, don't worry, I'll write the history myself. And he did. Sorry, yeah, that was my.
Well, the guy in Chile's going to write
thank
some
you for
new
that.
history. The guy in Chile's going to write some new history. And he's going to write it with all of those divide and conquered smaller countries and take over Brazil and Bolsonaro. So things are changing. It's different now. May happened in Palestine, Jerusalem. The young people, they won't put up with this stuff anymore. And that guy's 35 out of Chile. So maybe you don't need to have all this wisdom of the history books that are written by Churchill anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, all right. Well, I'm getting hungry for some pupusas, and they're waiting over there for us. And Jacques, I want to thank you for your great generosity with your time, and thank you, Lynn, for those last words and the mention of Chile. Que viva Chile! There's something in the chat about our friend Sergio Reyes giving a talk about recent happenings in Chile. It so happens Sergio is a good friend of this church, and let's see, I'm looking for the date on that. We will post some information on that on our Facebook page. We'd love to hear from Sergio at this moment in Chile's history. So off we go into the wild blue 2022. Thank you, Jacques, for getting us off on a good start. We really appreciate your wonderful talk, and I plan to listen to it again. And everybody, you can unmute yourself and show our appreciation to Jacques Pauwels for joining us today, and to Rod MacDonald, who had to scoot to take his daughter to an art class, and to all of you for joining us today. You can find this talk again on our YouTube channel.